Okay, so we can get started. Welcome everyone to this month's ICG invited lecture series. It's a pleasure to introduce Manuela Waldner to you, our dear speaker. Manuela is an assistant professor at TU Wien at the Institute of Visual Computing and Human-Centered Technology. And she actually did her PhD at the same time when I did my PhD at TU Graz. And then we moved into different directions. And we actually shared an office, I mean, not topic-wise. Manuela is still doing interactive visualization and everything that is related to it. She's doing super interesting work. And we're going to see her talk on scalable visual model inspection. And Manu, we're looking forward to your talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So thank you, Mark, for the introduction. I mean, you said pretty much everything about this slide, and that's usually what's happening when somebody introduces you. Maybe just to complete, I do have some academic roots also here in Upper Austria. I actually studied here at Hertha Firnberg. I did media technology and design. I think we were the first ones who actually did 5 years of bachelor's and master's here at the FH, and then I joined did the PhD program at TU Graz, and I also worked as an HCI, a human computer interaction researcher at the Center for Usability Research and Engineering before I went back to academia. So one of my research interests, I think, like generally speaking, what interests me most is everything that comes with scalability. So having large data, having complex data. What I work on a lot, and which is probably the main focus of my research, is visual attention guidance. So we have some people in our group, or we had people in our group that were working a lot with molecular visualizations. So really showing very complex processes in the human body, or also in other organisms. And and these are very, very complex, very dense animations. And we explored a lot of different visual attention guidance techniques to actually guide the users through a story in these complex displays. I also work a lot with multi-scale visualizations. So here, for instance, we have these, again, molecular scenes. So we had a multi-scale color model that we proposed and evaluated, but I also work with conventional information visualizations. We have very large bipartite graphs. The media transparency database in Austria is a very large data set, which shows where money flows between public authorities and media. And this is actually quite complex to visualize. Also, interactive machine learning I'm using in the context of scalability. I will talk about this today, so no more now. But also one aspect that I'm researching is, which I did in the past, not so much anymore, is large and immersive displays. So I did my PhD on large displays. So this was kind of a work that kind of dragged on after my PhD. That was also done together with Mark and Alex, where we analyzed how people structure information snippets they get from online on a large display. And also VR, for instance, large comorbidity networks, how to visualize them in VR, or again, molecular scenes. I'm also interested in heterogeneous data, so not just data that comes in a very structured and prepared format like in big tables, but for instance, how people structure unstructured evidence they get from the web, which comes in form of text and images, or how they do exploratory search. In terms of methods, I'm more of a basic researcher, so I'm doing a lot of human-centered research. Most of the work I'm doing is somehow related with user studies, more and more in crowdsourced studies, so Prolific or Mechanical Turk as platforms to do online studies, but also lab studies, especially in the past. Perception studies, like using eye-tracking devices, and also perceptual studies where really like we fix the user's head somewhere and then really have a very controlled environment and then measure their responses to some very, very controlled stimuli. I also sometimes do application-oriented research, especially in the field of biochemistry. So here we are collaborating with some biochemists that do long molecular dynamic simulations. And they're, again, very user-centered approach. We're working with case studies and design studies. And of course, research prototypes. So usually this is not myself who's building these research prototypes, but online playgrounds and also like integrated into a molecular dynamics software. So this is just a rough overview of what I do. What I want to focus on today is actually like the starting point for a project which will start now, which is called Joint Human Machine Data Exploration. I'm doing that together with Matthias Teppelzauer from the FH St. Pölten, who is a machine learning expert, me more on the visualization side. But it's a basic research project, and so it is about exploratory data analysis. So recently somebody asked me, like, exploratory data analysis, that's so 90s. And it's true, right? It's not, it doesn't sound like a very hip topic, but then again, it's not really solved. And especially the more and more data we're generating and the more complex data, the more challenging it becomes to not only detect the expected, but especially to discover something unexpected, right? And even more important it is if we collect so much data that we actually explore it without having to know beforehand what we're actually looking for. And just to give you a few examples why this is interesting. So one of the collaborators that we have, the protein engineers, they try to identify interesting sequences in very long molecular dynamic simulations or even ensembles of simulations. Now, what works pretty well is they sometimes know exactly what they're looking for, and they propose some queries and then they look at short sequences and look at a 4D visualization of that. Well, that works. But sometimes they would really like to peek inside of that simulation and see what else is happening. But this simulation, like looking at them, would just take days, right? So this is not really feasible. Similarly, biologists doing wildlife observations. So they have cameras, they're observing what animals are doing. And my colleague Matthias, he was doing research on multimedia retrieval. So once the biologists know what they're looking for, he was using machine learning to actually retrieve these sequences where this kind of behavior is happening. But the biologists would also be interested to find out something which they wouldn't know beforehand. Maybe something else is happening in there, which they do not know how to look for it. And a final example, social scientists. I mean, they often do this coding. They have long transcripts of interviews, of observations, what users are doing. And what they do to organize it is this open coding strategy. So they iteratively go over the transcripts, try to find out categorization and then apply it. But this is not, they do not know at the beginning what their categorization is, but they only find it out when they've seen all of the data. So we're dealing with large and unstructured data, so that calls for machine learning somehow. And in a traditional machine learning setup, what we would do now is that we define the targets, like a set of labels we're looking for, and then we would label our data instances, and then in the end train our model and then validate it. Now, what makes this approach unfeasible in exploratory analysis is because we do not know at the beginning what we're looking for. That's the major stumble stone, actually. But even if we knew, the label set we would have are very specific. If I have molecular dynamic simulations, I cannot just go to Mechanical Turk and let some crowd workers do the labeling for me. I really have to have experts to do the labeling. And finally, our final models may be very subjective in the end. So it really depends on the interests of the user and their prior experience, how the model will look like. So in this very project, what we're trying to achieve is we don't want to have a machine learning model that helps us analyze the data, but we rather want to have a model that helps us discover an interpretable structure in the data. And that then is useful to actually explore the data. And of course, we can also use the model to help the user explore it. So that's very abstract right now. But before I go into detail, I want to talk a little bit about this last step, because here we have some prior work where this project is built upon, and which will help to understand like where we want to go in the end. Okay, so this is my starting point. I'm sorry, I have to somehow get rid of this Zoom bar here. So this is my starting point. I think everybody here has probably seen this kind of similarity preserving scatter plots. They don't have this fancy name, or this one name. I call it similarity preserving scatter plots. Others just call it projections. We can fight about the name. This is a well-known example. It's from TensorFlow. It's the embedding projector, and basically it's a 2D scatter plot where each element here is one data item, and if they are similar in feature space, in this case the feature space are just the 784 pixels that we have in the image. If these are similar to each other, they're plotted very close to each other. And if they're dissimilar, they are far away. So here we have 10,000 items. And we do have this color coding based on the ground truth classes. So we know which digit it should be. And just by looking at the visualization, we can very quickly see how well our model, which we don't have at the moment, but our data, how that separates already into our ground truth classes by just seeing how well the colors match the spatial clusters. Now, if we would do that instead of the raw image data with activation vectors from a network that was trained to distinguish our 10 classes, then we could visually inspect if the model has properly learned the distinct features that make up the particular classes. So this is a very intuitive representation that most of the users understand quite quickly, and that's why I think it's very fascinating and worth investigating. So this is a recurring example that will come again and again. So that's a fashion amnist. So that's pretty much the same idea as the previous data set, but it's just a little bit, it has 10 classes, different kind of fashion items, and just the images are slightly more complex. And now if we would create such a projection with UMAP, that's one of the projection methods to create such a similarity preserving scatter plot, we can actually observe some very nice patterns here. Like here we have a cluster of 3 classes, which is ankle boots and sneakers and sandals, shoes. And here we have t-shirts and pullovers, dresses, coats and shirts, so tops. Here we have trousers, here we have bags. We also do have some outliers. We don't know like why we have shirts here intermingled with bags. So it gives us some of the idea what the model, in this case, it's really a very simple model, has learned to separate and also this hierarchical structure that we've learned. Now, these examples had a lot of data instances, but very few classes. And we were wondering like, but what if we have 1,000 classes? How can we solve this? And so the first work I want to present today was, it's called Concept Splatters, the exploration of latent spaces based on human interpretable concepts. So that was an attempt to have a visually scalable approach for such similarity preserving scatter plots. So what's the idea? How can we make these similarity preserving scatter plots more expressive? Now, the observation is that the axes of these scatter plots themselves are not interpretable. They don't have any meaning. If I would flip the whole thing, it wouldn't change the meaning. It's just the similarity, just the proximity that is relevant to us, not the absolute position. What is interpretable is the instances themselves. So the idea was we have to select a small but meaningful subset of our instances so that we can analyze the spatial distribution. So if I just pick a few random samples here for this cluster, I think everybody of us would conclude that we're seeing shoes here, different kind of shoes. And that's pretty much what it is. Can also help us analyze the outliers. So why is a shirt here? Maybe because it looks a little bit like a bag, doesn't look like a typical t-shirt. So this is very expressive if we have this kind of instances. So how do we select them? And the underlying principle is based on prototype theory. So that was a theory that was proposed in the 70s in cognitive psychology. And the idea of prototype theory is that humans tend to group items into semantic categories. They do this on different levels of abstraction. And on each level of abstraction, the goal is basically that we find a number of categories that is usable. So not too much, and not too many, and not too few. And these categories should be clearly differentiated from each other. So this is what humans tend to do. If you just give them a pile of images, they would categorize it hierarchically. The interesting thing about this is that each of these categories, if you would ask a human to represent each category by an example, they would pick a prototypical example that is very like central in terms of its features. So if we have, if we would ask people to represent the class, the category bird, they would rather pick a robin, a Rotkehlchen, rather than a penguin or an ostrich, for example, because it's more prototypical for birds. And so this is like the underlying principle that we applied. And the question is, where's the category coming from? And in case of fashionist, we just went to Zalando, because this is where the data set is from, just looked on the website. Because even on the website, you don't have a flat number of categories, they're somehow hierarchically organized. So we just picked that category to guide our exploration. And now the idea of the visualization was that the underlying question is essentially, does the categorization, which I expect from the data, fit the categorization that is found by the machine? And this human categorization, either it comes from an existing taxonomy, or I do it myself, kind of build up a hierarchy that I can apply here. So where does the machine categorization come from? Well, that's basically hierarchical clustering. We can do that in data space, in the high dimensional feature space. What we did in the first step was to do it actually in the visual space, so after the projection. And the method we used for clustering was a purely visual one. We used the splatter plot method. So that is a method to overdrawing scatter plots. So the idea is, if I have a very dense scatter plot with a lot of points, I compute a kernel density estimation on top of it, and then I just threshold it. So what I end up with are the dense regions. Depending on where I set my threshold, I find the dense regions. And with the threshold, I can also control how big my regions are and how dense I want these individual regions to be. So these are basically our clusters. So they do not include necessarily all the data points, but those that are most representative for the classes in terms from the visual feature space. So let's go to an example. Let's assume that the user wants to analyze shoes. So we've seen we have 3 different types of shoes in our data sets: the sandals, the sneakers, and the ankle boots. And this is and then we compute these splatter plots for each of the classes. So we take the elements that are associated with sandals and compute the splatter plots and so on. And so what you end up with are, in the end, these four splatters, which are one more than we have in the human categorization, and they're partially overlapping. So the question is, what does this mean now? And generally speaking, we can observe, these are kind of the high-level patterns that we can observe in this splatter space. Now, if we have 2 concepts that we want to separate and that we expect in the data, the default case would be that I have 2 blobs that are not overlapping. So that means we have a very high interclass variability. So the machine can separate these cases. They're very distinct in terms of their features, and they have a low intraclass variability. So that means within themselves, the classes are pretty coherent. So this is what we would expect. This is a pattern we can observe if we have low interclass variability. So that means our machine sees 2 classes, which we think are 2 different classes, but the features in terms of feature space that the machine has learned are very similar. So we do have an overlap. And here in this case, we would actually expect that the classification method would have a very hard time. This case here would be, we have high interclass variability. We can separate the classes, but at the same time, we also have a high intraclass variability. So within the classes, the machine actually sees fine-grained distinction that we would expect. And kind of the worst case would be a low interclass variability, high intraclass variability. So that would mean that the machine actually sees a completely different categorization than I would expect. Now let's just really confirm if this is really true, that if we have this kind of overlapping patterns, that at least indeed a classification network would have a hard time. So what we did was we took a couple of examples. So this is just plotted the elements that would be incorrectly classified as features. And indeed, we see that most of these cases are located within the areas where our splatters overlap. So that's kind of an indication that the machine is having hard. So this is a confusion matrix confirming that we have a strong confusion here between the glasses sneaker and ankle boot. So this works, but what it doesn't really show us yet is like, what do these classes actually have in common? So some of the sneakers and the ankle boots, and also not like, how do these two categories of sneakers that the machine has identified actually differ from each other? And here we come back to prototype theory. And we actually also looked into machine learning literature, and we found that when people use these projections, these similarity preserving scatter plots, they usually have some sort of annotation for it. So either they're plotting the instances themselves, if they have very few of them, or if they have many, they would use these insets to illustrate like different parts of the latent space and how they related to each other. So here just a couple of cars, so what an illustration of which types of cars the model has learned to distinguish. And also interesting for animal sounds, where you show the frequency patterns of the clusters of the animal sounds. So what we did was actually very, very simple. Just within each of these splatters, we drew 5 random samples. Nothing fancy about it. No. First we thought about, oh, let's take the median and then some outer parts, and just 5 random samples. And we actually found that this does the job pretty well. Just random samples out of these splatters can pretty well explain what's happening. So how do these two categories of sneakers differ from each other? They have low heels, but the lower, this cluster here actually has a very high shape, and these all have low shape. And then the next question, what do some of the sneakers have in common with the ankle boots? All low heels, high shape. They actually look very, very similar. And also we do have a few samples in here that also fall within that category. But just visually speaking, we can come up with a very nice characterization of what these different categories have in common and how they differ from each other. So here's how the entire interface then looks like. So we have multiple views here. Of course, they're linked, highly interactive. So here we have the latent view. So that's the actual projection with the splatters. Here we have the concept view. So this is the categorization that we expect. And to the detailed view will come later. So the linking works in a way that if I just hover one of these categories here, which has shown the insets for this specific category, and the detailed view actually then shows more examples. And what it also helps is that if I want to inspect, if I have some outliers of a specific concept that I expect in some of the other concepts, I can just draw a selection in projection space, and then I see the distribution in my concept space. So I see that most of the elements here are globals, but I also can navigate in this detail, investigate, like if I have some outliers from my other paths, which you wouldn't expect here, how they look like, and whether that can explain visually why they are considered to be similar with tops. So what we have here is this very simple Euler diagram that shows the intersection between the selection that I've made and the concept that I'm currently investigating. And what I see here is that the small part of my selection actually creates the bags, and the small part of the bags are my selection. Now recall that we have a hierarchy. And so we thought about like how we can bring multi-scale interaction into the whole process. And so for the concept space, so for the human interpretable concepts, that's pretty intuitive. So we just let users navigate in this icicle plot, and that just filters the elements that we want to show recomputes the splatters, and filters the data instances. Also, the color map is adjusted, so otherwise it would become very hard to read. And we use these tree map color codes for this. So again, what we see is that we have the trousers, which are very separate, and we have these two splatters here of shirts. So they somehow have two distinct subclasses, and they also overlap a lot with the codes and the dresses. So how do we do the multi-scale exploration on the machine side? And here the one fancy aspect of the splatter plots come into play, and that's that we actually have two parameters for which we can tweak the appearance of these splatters in visual space. The one is the threshold I've already mentioned. So I have this density. So this is kind of, you can imagine, this is a subsection through my 2D space. So I have these densities here. It's a continuous approximation of the probability density function that we see here. And I kind of cut it here. But the other parameter that I can influence is the bandwidth. So how broad my Gaussian is basically that I fit on top of every screen space. And with that, I can control how broad my density is approximated. And by adjusting these two parameters, I have a very fine-grained control over the appearance of these clusters and how the distribution. On a side note, I have to say, like in theory, that sounded very nice. In practice, it's a little bit hard to control. So if you have a certain shape in mind that you would like to approximate, like tweaking these two parameters is actually harder than expected. So just as a side note. But now if we go back to the base class and we change the bandwidth, play around with bandwidth and the threshold so that we actually split up these classes that we found for this clothing category, we can see how that splits up the data, but not so much into these categories that we would expect, the dresses, the coats, and the shirts, but rather like based on the width somehow of the shape of the items. So here we have long t-shirts, long dresses, rather long dresses and coats, long sleeve, also long sleeve, but somehow oddly shaped, but not exactly what we would expect. Now let's scale it up. So this was fashion image, just to explain the concept. Now we want to go to ImageNet with 1,000 classes. So ImageNet, I don't know how familiar people are here with ImageNet. So that's kind of a benchmark data set for image classification. It's pretty old already. It's kind of from images collected from the web, and we're using here the validation data set, which has 50 to 70,000 elements. And at some point, it was kind of the gold standard benchmark data set for image classification. And now we need a hierarchy, right? And the nice thing about ImageNet is when we thought about like categorizing it hierarchically, it is actually already categorized hierarchically, because we do have labels like cat and dog in that data set, but in fact what it's using is so-called synsets. But it's a WordNet categorization. WordNet is a manually curated taxonomy about everything. And these synsets basically describe words by their semantic meaning. So you might have one label which is actually associated in different synsets. And so we directly just using this hierarchy. It was cleaned up a little bit because some parts of the hierarchy were not used. It's not strictly hierarchical. So here we have dogs, which are both domestic animal and subcategory of mammal at the same time. But we approximated the hierarchy somehow to make it working. And yeah, maybe I will directly jump to that one because you see it's a bit unbalanced. I will directly jump to this synset, which is called whole, which is kind of the most tangible synset, parent synset in WordNet, which distinguishes the objects in organisms and artifacts, man-made things and living things, and natural objects, which are like and just to be network that we're using was a pre-trained inception. And of course, this network is not trained on the hierarchy. It has only been trained on the actual levels, like the low-level layer. So it has learned that this is a lot of dogs. I think it has learned 100 different dog breeds here, but it has never learned that the dog is an animal artifact. So it's very interesting to see actually that if we look at the latent space from a perspective, that we can see very, very clear separation into organisms and artifacts. So inherently, the network has learned to separate these two things very well. But again, we also see that we do have some separation here. So cars seem to be a very distinct part of the artifact superclass. And also for the animals, I mentioned already that many dog breeds in ImageNet. So this is very clear. We have a very strong dog cluster. And here more the insects and reptiles and the other animals. So the big question was, how do we validate this, right? I mean, if you do scientific work, you can do stuff and you can present it and it sounds convincing, but then in the end, you have to somehow show that this also works. And the method that we chose to do here is, I mean, of course, the obvious thing is you run a user study, right? I mean, I thought I'm doing this here as a presentation mainly for researchers, so I don't want to scare the students off. But the classic expectation, if you have interactive visualizations, often a study with actual users, and it does make sense, but it's a very hard example to do properly as just as a small part of a project that would be reported like in one page of the paper. The reason is simply there's no clear baseline to compare to, so it's not clear what is the state of the art. How would you visualize that otherwise? There are different methods, but all of them have limitations, otherwise we wouldn't have come up with this. And the other thing is, we don't have a clear task, it's exploratory. And exploratory tasks are always very, very hard to evaluate in controlled studies. So what we did instead was we looked into the machine learning literature and looked for observations about the data that we're visualizing here, and just looked if we can see it. So things that have not been visualized, just described verbally in papers, and we looked in our visualization if we can actually visually observe that. First case, the tench. The tench class, a large fish species, is often identified by fingers on front of a greenish background. I don't know, some of you work in, you're smiling a bit, maybe you've encountered this example. It's actually a prominent example that comes up in some of the visualization papers also. And I was wondering, like, will we see that like in our visualization? And we just started from the top class that I've shown, like the whole class. We changed, with the default parameters, we didn't see it immediately, but we changed a little bit the level of abstraction on the machine side for the splatters. It was just popping into our face. So here it is. It's right here on the top level, you can see the tench. And the interesting thing is that most of the literature, or all of the literature, reports about this tench class, but actually a couple of fish classes that fall into that category, and just as frequency bars indicate how many images we have in that splatter, a couple of classes that fall into that category. So it really bumps into our face. However, what's cool was a nice confirmation that this basically works. We then navigated into the fish class and actually see here a very, very clear cluster of all the fish images where people hold fish in hands, fish on the water, other types of funny fish. I'm really bad with fish, I'm sorry. But what was also interesting is that the tench class itself was basically separated into two splatters. And when we looked at the examples of these two splatters, but we have one hand side, the people holding the fish, and here it's lying on plastic. There's not a single image in the whole data set where the fish is alive. It only consists of dead images. So that was something that goes a little bit beyond of what has been reported in the literature. And just as a comparison, maybe as one of the state-of-the-art techniques, sometimes here these grids of images that are also similarity preserving, but try to fill up the space. And we do, we do see the fish here as well, but it's not so popping up so clearly as we've seen in our example. Second example, edible fruit. So the thing with the edible fruits synset is that some papers have reported a high variability within each of the four synsets. We have more than that, but each of the children in this synset are actually hard to distinguish because they are not really distinct to each other, but also they have a very high variability within themselves. And so we navigated to the edible fruit synset and we looked at how the visualization looks like. And I think it's pretty clearly visible that we can observe this as well. So we have this, eight, nine different fruit classes, and we see that they are very, very fragmented in our space. They're usually separated in multiple spaces. So let's just look at one, like the fig. So here we have a fig in the tree, a fig in the hand, multiple whole figs in the cut one, the citrus fruits, lemons and oranges. We have whole fruits in trees, cut fruits. We see a pattern here, right? And just by manual selection, so there's a fake image, I just put it together. This is like manual selection that didn't. Well, this is basically what the machine has learned. And this doesn't correspond to the categorization that we expected and what the network was trained on, but something else, which also makes sense, but it's not what it has been trained on. And again, a comparison to the image grid. So we can see this variability, so we can see what the network has learned, but it's harder to see like how this matches our expected categorization. And a final example, we also wanted to see, these were all classification networks and image-based examples. How does that work with words, unsupervised? And we have word embeddings that are just trained without any supervision, so they try to learn the similarity to other words. And one observation is that each dimension of the vectors encodes different aspects of the words, and in embedding space, semantically close words are likely to cluster together and form semantic cliques. So what we did was we took all the words in the vocabulary of word2vec and we matched them to synsets. So we lost a couple of words here because not all of them existed in both data sets, and some of the words have been classified to multiple synsets because some words just exist multiple times in WordNet. And then we did the same visualization, but instead of having the insets with the images, we showed the words themselves. And so we have the same categorization that we've seen with ImageNet before, and we now start on the same level, namely the separation between living objects and artifacts. And just to confuse you a bit, I changed the color code, so now the artifacts are not purple anymore but green, but the message is pretty much the same. We see a very clear separation between living things, I'm confusing myself here, living things and artifacts and natural objects. And there are some overlaps, there are also some clusters, like here we have animals. Here we have two natural objects like supernova, antiproton, ion. I don't know how you would semantically describe this kind of class, but clearly it's distinct from fruits. And musical instruments, very distinct in our word embedding. And then we go into living things and look if we have a separation between animals. What was the third one? Persons and I believe plants. Again, very strong separation, right? The dogs are always separate. We have the cluster of dogs, here the remaining animals. Human beings or persons, very interesting nationalities form a separate cluster. For artifacts, we don't have a separation. So here the separation that is coming from WordNet, like instrumentality, structure, creation, kind of a weird categorization. It doesn't fit at all the clusters that are formed in word2vec. So that was how we validated the thing. And now I warned Mark beforehand. There's a small trigger warning. So if you have been a review of the paper, maybe I'm not mean, but maybe you wanna leave the room. So I told you, of course, there was the thing like, how do we validate that? And this was what we chose. And of course, everybody who's working in science knows the thing with rejections. They happen sometimes, more often than we would wish. So this paper has been rejected a couple of times. And the first time we sent it to ICG, that the feedback was lack of evaluation, only visual results, interface is hard to interact. It is hard to interact. It's clearly not polished. It works. I have a link also afterward, but it's clearly not polished. No formal evaluation, like a user study. And I was like, I'm a stubborn person. I was like, I'm not doing a user study. So we cannot do the major, it was a major revision. We cannot do the major revision. I'm refusing to do a user study because I don't know how to do it properly. I have no idea. And so the decision was we one step back, we sent it to computers and graphics, which is just not as strict as TCG, right? So we sent it to computers and graphics. I did the clustering validity metrics. So that was done. And it was a good idea, actually. And we discussed a little bit the different dimensionality reduction algorithms. So fair enough. I mean, everybody who's working with projections know that we lose a lot of information by doing dimensionality reduction. We do get errors, different kind of algorithms introduce different kind of errors. But it made, like on a high level, it made very little difference, actually. So we did that, submitted it again to computers and graphics, and then we're like, why the techniques, major revision, why the techniques seems both interesting and useful. The claims regarding interactive applications would require a user study. And then I gave in. Yeah, I'm a stubborn person, but I gave in. And just to conclude this, a few results from the user study. Of course, you cannot do a formal user study about this, not in this paper. You can do a formal user study, but then if you do this properly, this is a paper on its own. Because it's really not clear, you would have to investigate the design space. This is not an A-B comparison because I don't know what the A is. And so what we did instead was a qualitative study. So we asked a couple of people who have a little bit of a knowledge about machine learning, who have an intuition what the latent space is, who know the data a little bit. I think with 4 or 5 people exploring the system, having help because it was sometimes hard to interact from time to time. And I mean, it was nice to see that they saw pretty much these obvious things that we also observed in the literature and could visually confirm. So that was nice. They had a little add-on sometimes, like the one user like, it also looks like an airplane. That's interesting. So these little things we did not consider. That was also interesting. Like one user found the some overlap between artifacts, things that were actually labeled as artifacts, kind of structures to be strong, very, very similar to organisms, and kind of like that makes sense, right? And I think everybody who's looking at the images can agree that this totally makes sense. So in that sense, it was interesting, but I don't really have any interesting insights to report from the study. If you want to try it yourself, I didn't put the QR code here because I don't want you to use your cell phone because that doesn't work. Interface from time to time does work, but this is really the exception. This is really, it has been implemented for desktop usage. So if you want to use it, I think this is recorded and I can also send out the link afterwards. Good, so I'm totally running out of time, right? I'm talking too much. I will make this quick. So here we were working now with ground truth labels that actually were known. If we want to look at interactive machine learning settings, the big difference is that we do not know the ground truth labels beforehand. And this actually makes the task very difficult because we actually have to inspect visually if the color actually matches what we're looking for. So very briefly, I want to summarize some findings from a study where we were investigating if these similarity preserving layouts actually make sense for visual model accuracy during interactive machine learning. And with interactive machine learning, I mean these visual interactive labeling scenarios. So I need my cursor here to start the video, where you interactively change the labels and then the system is retrained in the background. So the question here is, the user does have to make this kind of visual matching as beforehand, but the big difference is to actually decide, like, is my model already stable enough or do I need to do more retraining? But the big difference is that instead of just matching the colors, whether they match my clusters, I actually have to look if the instances match my predicted labels. So I actually have to look at every item individually. And of course, if my data is getting more complex, this task is becoming more difficult. So if we do not have our toy example fashion images, but some animal images, this is getting more complex. And the big question about this study was, what about the layout? Like, does it matter if our things are actually located close together? Because what's actually can happen is that the model that we have in the background was trained to detect something which I'm actually not looking for. So maybe I'm here not looking for bright and dark shirts, but for long sleeve was short sleeves. And the question was, if such a non-optimal grouping, which actually emphasizing a different feature, if that affects my visual model accuracy estimation compared to a layout that actually supports my task very well. So this was the experiment. So we did this online on Mechanical Turk, so people could just look at the projection with 400 images and four classes. We had these two different image sets, and the users would then just select their estimation of how many labels in percentage are correct. So we'll skip the experimental factors. It was kind of tricky to set up the experiment to answer these kind of questions, actually, and just jump to the conclusions directly. Yes. So people can do it. That works actually pretty well. So these were untrained users. People can estimate how well the model predicts the labels, actually, just from looking at such a similarity preserving scatter plot. Much better than the machine in this case, where we just used the cross-validation for the training data set, which was very, very small in that example. The image complexity, well, of course, that was expected. It does affect the results, but only in terms of time. So users take a longer time to solve the task, but they're actually just as good. What was more interesting is we had these different layout settings, and these settings varied very strongly. So in some parts, really just had a random layout, whereas in other cases, we had features that really corresponded to the labels users were looking for, and they were also very tight together. And this didn't make a difference. It's not that it made a small difference, it just didn't make a difference at all. And so the conclusion of this study was that for visual model accuracy estimation and interactive machine learning tasks, it seems that the layout really doesn't make a big of a difference. And this is surprising, right? Because there's a lot of evidence that grouping is very important for many tasks. So here, for instance, they have shown that if I want to figure out if there's one item that has a different color, it's much easier if my colors are sorted than if they're just random. There are also other evidence that, for instance, image retrieval does not benefit so much if I have a similarity preserving layout than just a random grid layout. And what we observed informally when we analyzed the interaction logs from the users was the users zoomed in once, it panned a little bit, and they didn't zoom out again, they didn't correct, it just from a very small part of the screen, they generalized to the entire model. So what I think, and here we're standing actually at the status quo where I would also like to continue in this project, it makes sense to really selectively sample and to select very representative samples if we want to show what the machine has actually learned. And to come back to the project, what we would like to achieve is, on the one hand side, we want to investigate like how can we figure out what the user expects from the data? What kind of structure the user sees in the data? How can we do that in a very effective way so that the user's workflow during data exploration is not disturbed? And how can a machine learning model capture this evolving structure that the user is seeing? And then finally, which I find most interesting, is how can we represent the data and the frames of what the user expects from the data so that we can actually trigger the user to elaborate, question, and reframe the data. And so this is kind of the workload distribution. So it's more like the visualization interaction side, it's more on our side, and the FR support side is dealing with the machine learning questions. We do have 3 years to answer these questions, so I hope we will manage. I'm also very happy to collaborate on this. I'm also very happy to employ you. I have an open PhD position in that project. And with that, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Oh,
Yes.
Oliver posted, not Oliver Bimben, Oliver posted the link. Thank you very much. In the Zoom.
Thank you. There's definitely some overlap with what we do, so I expect there are many questions. But if you are online and if you have questions, feel free to unmute yourself and let us know. It should be, should work well with the setup here. Or you can also use the chat, and we will have an eye on the chat. Right, questions. Who wants to go first?
So the examples you showed, I think the setting the individual samples was straightforward. So features and words.
Yeah.
But in the beginning, you also said that you have lecture sequences, much more abstract.
Yes, definitely. I mean, that's a big challenge. I mean, we're making our life easy here. We're just picking the easy examples. Anyway, I think if we think about molecular dynamic sequences, apart from the fact that I wouldn't know like which model to use here, to be very honest, I think it would already help the protein engineers a lot if they would just be able to see short sequences, you know, and just have triggers to maybe look at that one and not just having the whole bunch of sequences and yeah, not knowing where to go there. Yeah. So I guess I would just show the videos, like the 4D videos. When I say videos, I mean the 4D visualization, so the 3D visualization with a time component. But we could, of course, also think of, and this has been done in the context of ND simulation visualization, to aggregate sequences into single snapshots and to focus on what is happening in these short sequences. That could be very interesting in that context, actually. I think this is, I mean, long answer short, I think it is a bit application specific, but you're right, it's a crazy.
Okay. Questions?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, so in that concept, that you got the prototypes, but it was randomly selected.
Yeah. I was very unhappy about this, but
that you just hope that they somehow actually use prototype.
yeah. I mean, we did the random selection first. I wasn't very unhappy with that. Love to see more random selection. That's the thing that you have to don't do it yourself. But the thing was, what was very interesting is it did the job very well. So for a couple of examples, we actually then draw a large, much larger sample. And from the high-level characteristics that we could extract from these few samples, most of the cases, or actually, I think even in almost all cases, that fit to the end, like also to a larger sample. So it might seem trivial, but for us, it actually did the job pretty well. I do have follow-up work from a different student, but it wasn't integrated with that prototype to actually do the more elaborate selection technique as one item. And that's more, yeah.
But actually, was my question, because you got the prototype task with British.
Yeah, exactly.
Which would be the ones that don't?
Yes, yes, that was exactly the one.
Okay, so you think there are also obviously some tasks that makes more sense.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'm really urgently investigating exactly that question. So I only have anecdotal evidence so far, which makes me very unhappy because of the basic research and I want to answer this question, but this is exactly the question I also have. So, formally speaking, you're right, this is what we would want. Exactly what we would want. So on the one hand side, one or maybe so I actually would like to train because that's what I would really like to do, because then you would actually find out also and have the criticisms explicitly specified. So that would be my dream.
So you said you are marking clustering on the object space and space, and that is interesting to know what elements they used, for instance.
I mean, here we didn't really do hierarchical clustering. We just tweaked the parameters visually. So we just used the splatter plots. I have a follow-up work which actually worked in data space and used a hierarchical k-means, which works well for some data sets and not so well for others. But the k-means has the advantage that it computes fast. So that was because for an interactive system, that was actually very important. And from terms of the cluster metrics, it was not worse than others, but just significantly faster. I mean, you can show this. Let me see, because I do have a comparison of that somewhere. So these were, for instance, just so here we have 10 clusters and how they're connected in high dimensional space. So these would be 2 splatters in the splatter plots. And I think the visual characteristics are very, very comparable. And let's just use as a k-means. There was a different data set, flowers data set used with the pre-trained inception with the ImageNet. And also the characteristics are very similar. So these separate clusters here, they are pretty much the same. So again, only anecdotal evidence, unfortunately, but it seems like both methods seem to be working fine, at least for those data sets. I mean, for the flowers data set, we really had a very, very bad silhouette coefficient. So there was, but also with the concept splatters that didn't separate very well.
Questions the presentation.
Oh, they can also talk afterwards. I mean, I haven't booked the train back yet, so that's fine.
I have one question. So how so you applied it to images and you applied it to words, word to work. Have you thought about applying it, or the ideas about how it could be applied to more mixed feature vectors, right? If you have a patient and you have all kinds of heterogeneous, continuous, and categorical attributes, and you need to like pick the ones from the feature vector that characterize the cluster. It's a bit different task, but can you read some of the methods you develop?
Well, if you have a model that in the end one, like the heterogeneous data vector, which should be possible, then you can use this kind of visualization. Then I think it's a very similar question to what Klaus was asking. Then it's really a question of how do I represent one item. And again, it could be like you presented before this attention-based thing, then you could actually have a very smart method to actually really focus on those aspects that are very distinct from the others. So I think that's something which is very interesting to go beyond this very, very simple data. It's Christina.
I'm interested in the use of WordNet. So in one use case, you ImageNet data.
I think it was extending the time to the absolute maximum. Sorry, yeah, WordNet. I guess so. See, I don't even know. Yeah, I guess so. Yes.
So did you? I know.
Yeah. So that was really the idea also of having this concept space. So you have, when you select hierarchy now, but these are basically the labels that we have, right? So it's, I don't know if there would be children's sets to that, I'm not sure, but these are the children that we use. But we meant like everything that is labeled with penge automatically also goes to superunion, whatever that is, and so efficient, also efficient. So we did do the mapping to the parents also. So every child is also automatically part of the parent category.
So how did you choose the concepts?
Basically we built the hierarchy. Here we have it. We built the hierarchy bottom up. So we started with all the synsets that we had in the bottom layer, and then we just built the hierarchy to the very top. Sometimes we skipped some parts of the hierarchy because it would be identical to the parent hierarchy. And so that's why it's sometimes a bit odd. And sometimes we also have multiple parents, like for the dog.
But Werner is like really huge.
Yeah. But ImageNet is not. It's just covering a small part of WordNet. So it has 1,000 classes, and these 1,000 classes are here.
Yeah.
And then we built the hierarchy on top of it that covers these 1,000 children.
Okay, thank you. So in the interest of time, we have to stop here, but Manu will stay here and we can follow up on this discussions. Thanks again, everyone, for joining. If you do the seminar and you join online, we are recording the attendance. If you're here, then please add your signature to the sheet of paper. That the talk for April is not set yet, the date, but we have a speaker already, but that will be followed up soon and announced soon. With that, I'm closing the session for today. Thank you again, Manu, for visiting us. It was super interesting, and yeah, have a nice rest of the day.
Thank you. Just leaving, right?